This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our studios in the beautiful mountains of Western North Carolina. I'm delighted to have Richard Hughes as my co-host today.
Hey, Dr. Moody, how are you?
That's good to see you, Richard.
Good to be here. Good to be here.
Reverend Hughes is a native of Louisville, a graduate of Simmons College, and just this spring received his Master of Divinity degree from the Wake Forest School of Divinity at the university here in North Carolina. He is now the preaching pastor of the St. James Presbyterian Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. And he's just been elected to a 2-year term as a director for our nonprofit, the Meetinghouse Incorporated.
Yes,
Welcome,
sir.
Richard.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in this and to be a part of the Meetinghouse. I certainly do not take it lightly, and it is certainly an honor to be affiliated with the great work that you're doing. I remember we had connected through the Academy of Preachers, and so I am a direct beneficiary of your work, and so I thank you for that.
Thank you, Richard. I made a visit to Greensboro last month with my grandson, and my grandson lives in Charlotte, which I think is where you live, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
And I picked him up. He's 13 years old, and we went up to Greensboro. We visited the Revolutionary War battle site, and then we went down to the famous Woolworth store where I had never been. Now a museum, of course. We took lots of pictures. I told him the story about all the sit-in and all of that. It was a wonderful visit. It's great to have you on the show today.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
At the end of the show, I hope, if we have time, I have a commentary entitled A Wave of the Hand, if we can get to it. I have 5 news stories today, as always, and brought to you by PerfectoCoffeeInc.com. And then my special guest is Jennifer Jones Austin. And I'll be talking with her about the re-release of the book that her father published in 1979, God in the Ghetto. It's come out in a new expanded edition, and we're going to talk with her about that. I'll introduce her in just a few minutes after we run through the news here. From Nashville, Tennessee, the new president of the Southern Baptist Convention appointed a task force to lead the denomination to address issues of sexual abuse. The 7-member group is led by 2 white male pastors, but includes 2 women, one of them a lawyer from Tennessee and the other a therapist from Pennsylvania. A few years ago, a former Southern Baptist woman and an Olympic athlete by the name of Rachel Denhollander started much of the conversation about the abuse of female athletes in the Olympic system. She will serve as a special consultant to the task force. In the meantime, 2 Southern Baptist ministers have been arrested on sexual abuse charges. David Nims of Pensacola and Matthew Brewer of Nashville, Tennessee. All the way to California from Los Angeles, the Barna Research Group, a public opinion research organization with special focus on religion, released the results of a nationwide survey conducted in January of 2021. One summary statement reads like this: self-identified Christians are consistently more likely than all U.S. adults to view America as historically Christian, as blessed and chosen by God, as made up of immigrants, and as a leader to the rest of the world, and as not oppressive to minorities, end quote. Barna compared these results from a similar study in 2019 and demonstrated that attitudes had shifted measurably during the turbulent year of 2020. Christians now more convinced of the Christian status of our nation and less convinced of its history of oppression. How in the world could that be, Richard? How in the world could we go through 2020 and the majority of Christians in America come out thinking more strongly that we don't have a history of oppression? That seems strange to me, doesn't it to you?
Oh, yeah. I believe with having to be quarantined and with social distancing measures put in place, that gave a lot of people to further have an opportunity to further distance themselves away from the evidence of oppression in America. They were able to quarantine and cave themselves in their own castles without realizing that there are people living in conditions that are the total antithesis to those situations.
Very interesting.
Oh, yeah. And so it caused them to kind of, I would say forget, but overlook the fact that there is a real oppression taking place for many in this country. And we're dealing with the fallout of that currently in 2021.
No question about that. From Washington, D.C., the Public Religion Research Institute, associated with best-selling author and Meetinghouse guest Robert P. Jones, released its analysis of what the 2020 National Census reveals about religion in America. Quote, over the last few decades, the proportion of the U.S. population that is white and Christian has declined by nearly 1/3. As recently as 1996, almost 2/3 of the Americans identified as white and Christian. By 2006, that had declined to 54%, and by 2017, it was down to 43%. The census demonstrated that the decline in Christianity reached a low point in 2018 and is now on a small upswing, fueled by stronger numbers among white mainline Protestants. Interesting. From Chicago, Christianity Today interviewed influential Pentecostal prophet Jeremiah Johnson. They published their results in an article that detailed his history of prophecies, including the triple prediction last fall regarding the World Series, the Supreme Court, and the national election. He was wrong on one of them, but right on the other two. His Trump to win prophecy was followed by an apology to his religious tribe, which was in turn followed by vicious rejection of his apology by his donors and supporters. He has since shut down his Charlotte-based prophecy ministry and launched an initiative called the Altar Global that emphasizes humility, evangelism, and a renewed focus on Jesus rather than Donald Trump. Richard, are you familiar with this name and this ministry?
A little bit. I did see it in the news, but one thing I will say, I guess he's not like the Houston Astros. He didn't see the sign coming. So,
referring there to the great scandal in baseball 2 years ago.
Oh yeah. It's very interesting. Just the whole idea with prophecy and how that has caused much debate in Christendom, anyways. But to have this right here and him trying to back the Trump presidency and fuel what ended up being the insurrection. It's definitely not a good look. Definitely not a good look. But I often say, sometimes people like him, I don't necessarily fault him. I fault the people that give him a platform.
Right.
Because they make him relevant.
I have reported on this several times over the last 6 months, Richard, a number of stories about these Pentecostal prophets that really fascinate me. And I'm interested in, of course, they're in Charlotte, just 2 hours from me, and right there in your town. I need to go over there and visit with him, I think.
I think we can schedule a time to do that together.
Okay, that's a good idea. From Mobile, Alabama, sexual abuse is not the only issue making headlines among Southern Baptists this week. The new SB president, Ed Litton, has been accused of plagiarizing the sermons of his predecessor, J.D. Greer of North Carolina. That's over in the Durham area of North Carolina. Passages in a sermon posted on Litton's church website contain lengthy passages lifted apparently from a sermon by Greer. The sermon now has been taken down, and then shortly after, more than 150 of the Litton sermons have been removed from the website. Calls for his resignation have come mainly from those in the SBC who supported his rival for the presidency, Mike Stone. It has generated much conversation, not so much about politics, but about the rights and wrongs of using the material of others in a sermon. I've had a number of conversations over the last few days with colleagues of mine about this issue, and I may do a whole program on it. But that's all the news, sponsored by Perfecto Coffee of California. Order some coffee at perfectocoffeeinc.com. I'm Dwight A. Moody with Richard Hughes in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute with Jennifer Jones Austin. You're in the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. My guest today is Jennifer Jones Austin of New York City. Jennifer, welcome to the Meetinghouse.
I'm excited to be here with both you, Dr. Moody, and Reverend Hughes. Thank you for having me.
Jennifer is the COO of FPWA. I had to look that up, Jennifer. Formerly known as the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, founded in 1922, which means next year is your anniversary. What are you doing special to commemorate the 100 years?
So first and foremost, let me say that we're doing the work. That is what I believe is most important and what is most special. FPWA, the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, was founded in New York City at a time when social services, housing supports, childcare, services for children in foster care, elderly supports were doled out based on race and religion. So it was the case that if you were Jewish, then you were cared for by Jewish organizations. If you were Catholic, you were cared for by Catholic institutions. And essentially the all other, Black and brown not representing as Catholic, and all other people who didn't identify as being affiliated with any particular religion were deemed Protestant. And for the most part, that was Black and brown children and their families. Mm-hmm. And so the organization was created to be essentially the voice at the policy-making table for individuals and families identifying as Protestant or other, and again, largely brown and Black children and their families. And 100 years later, nearly 100 years later, we're an organization with better than 170 human service organizations, nonprofits operating in the greater New York area. We have many faith partners. Many of the nonprofits that are in our umbrella are faith-led, but in the main, I should say faith-rooted. They're not just Protestant. We've now got Catholic, Buddhist, Muslim, and Jewish organizations as well. So for the 100th, we're centering on our roots, our very beginnings, which is really, being the Good Samaritan and lifting up and serving everybody, just as Jesus taught us to do. And a lot of our work right now is centered on true equity, as it always has been, but leaning in even more, looking at everything from racial and gender equity, and how that manifests in everything from housing to income and asset building, to looking at the criminal justice system and the intersection with race and with poverty.
Wow, that's a big portfolio that you're working on. We're going to talk about your book in just a minute. I do want to tell our listeners and viewers that Jennifer Jones Austin is a lawyer, an activist, and author. Her first book count it all joy. I think I remember right about your
Consider it pure joy. Just the new version.
new version. It's about your journey as a cancer survivor. You're a keynote speaker. You're a radio and television host. So this is old hat to you, isn't it, Jennifer?
You know what? Every one of these experiences is new for me. And, being with you is a little intimidating, and with Reverend Hughes, but I'm going to try to hold my own today.
I can't imagine that you're intimidated by somebody like me. Jennifer, you're up there in New York City, mixing it up with people of influence and power. But I'm glad to count you as a friend and welcome you to the Meetinghouse today. Let me ask, before we get to the book, let me ask you how the COVID has impacted the work of your organization over the last year.
So, let's see. I will first begin by saying that what COVID did was help us all to appreciate all the more the disparities that persist in our society, and especially for lower income persons of color. In New York and around the country, we have seen that COVID has devastated many individuals and families, people of all races and ethnicities, but people of color all the more. And that's because for so long we've had disparities in essential determinants, social determinants of public of health. And what I mean by that is when you are poor, then you don't have high quality access to healthcare, to housing, and that it affects how you show up and your health and well-being. When you are poor, you don't have good mental health care and supports. You don't have the ability to sit back and weather storms, great storms like COVID. And so in this nation where, frankly, Black and brown persons have since slavery been paid at lesser wages than white people, when Black and brown persons have been relegated in the main to subpar housing and subpar education experiences. Those are all the social determinants of health. And so when a storm hits, and my daddy used to preach all the time about the storms of life, he'd say you're either in a storm, coming out of one, or about to go through one. But when the big storms hit, you don't have the capacity if you're without basic supports. If you have been denied fair wages, then you haven't been able to build up an asset reservoir to weather the storm when it hits. Right. If you don't have quality healthcare in your community, then you're not going to be able to readily access the supports that COVID requires. And so what we've seen in New York and we've seen around the country is people have been devastated, and persons of color all the more. My organization has stepped up to try to be responsive to those needs, but also to engage in the work of recovery, such that we're addressing these disparities as we go. And we're saying, as we rebuild, let's rebuild with fair paying jobs. Let's rebuild with healthcare systems in our communities. Don't just come to that Black and brown community, with a health mobile when you want us to take up the vaccine. Come, to engage in preventive care. Yeah. So that's the work that we're centered on right now.
Well, you and a horde of public sector workers have, of course, been on the front lines of dealing with this pandemic all year. But right in the middle of it, I don't know how this happened. Right in the middle of it, you found time to edit and publish a book. I have it right here in my hand, God in the Ghetto. Your dad published it, I think, in 1979, the first edition. And William A. Jones, I'm glad to say, from Kentucky, as Richard and I both are from Kentucky.
Yeah.
And your dad went to New York City to pastor the Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn, stayed for 43 years. I believe I want to remember right that he passed away in 2006. Do I remember that right?
That's correct.
And they brought him back to Lexington, Kentucky to lay him there in the great Lexington Cemetery.
Yes, he loved Kentucky, and his faith and his convictions about what the gospel requires of faith leaders, essentially was rooted in his upbringing in Kentucky. His father was a reverend, as was his grandfather.
Mhm.
And they both were very much involved in, the preaching and practice of the gospel as Jesus demonstrated and taught and modeled, referencing Jesus as a revolutionary, as a man of faith who essentially preached and taught that we have to, as disciples, be engaged to the work of serving, lifting up our brothers and sisters, and essentially rejecting all of those systems and structures that serve to put certain people in places of lower status, human status. And so Dad got his rooting in the social gospel in Kentucky, and determined that was where he wanted to be essentially laid to rest.
Well, most of us know that your dad was one of the preeminent preachers in America, black or white, during his career. He has a reputation that is exceeded by none. And I want to say, I've said this in public several times, that the Jones family, your extended family, I know many of them, as you know, is the most distinguished and accomplished African-American family in the state of Kentucky. And sometimes I want to drop that color designation and say it's just the most distinguished and accomplished family in Kentucky. I know you're up there in New York City, but we honor all of your family. As you know, I've been with them, and my sons went to high school with some of your kin, and I've been in the great Pleasant Green Baptist Church a number of times. And so I want to honor you for this family, for your dad. You've come out with the revised, enlarged edition of this book, A Prophetic Word Revisited. Why did you want to do this?
So first, let me just say that you are being extremely generous in your words concerning my family, and I very much appreciate that. We Joneses were raised with an understanding and appreciation that God gives you gifts, and that you are to use them for the glory and edification of God's kingdom. And so all I can simply say is that, we've been blessed because we've been taught that, and we've sought to try to do it. We have our faults and we have our weaknesses, but we're just trying to live in the strengths that God has given us. So thank you. I republished God in the Ghetto because I believe that in this moment, the faith leaders of today, as well as the faith-led, need to hear a prophetic word about how God intends for us to show up in the world. When you begin today's Meetinghouse, you talked about some data that is out there concerning how Christians today are thinking about both Christianity and about oppression. And what I found very interesting as you talked about it, as you said that it seems that Christians believe that there's less oppression, or don't believe in oppression, or that it really is a factor. There are more who don't believe in that. It very much mirrors what we have experienced in America since the earliest days of slavery. It was the Christian community, largely the white and evangelical Christian community, that determined that slavery was not a sin. That essentially that, Black persons were less than human, the descendants of Ham, and less than human. And so they could be treated as less than and treated as inferior. In the book, Dad writes that the racist ascribes to God a posture of partiality. and then assigns men their permanent places under the sun on the basis of their pigmentation. Right? He writes that essentially, the Christian church found a way to say that, they were not violating the scriptures in the Bible by essentially enslaving Black persons because Black persons were less than. And what Dad does is in this book, God in the Ghetto, he helps us all to appreciate was that was a essentially wicked and nefarious interpretation of scripture and not accurate. And so what he does in this book is helps us to understand what the Bible really says about humanity and all of mankind and what Jesus taught. And so in this moment where America is yet again experiencing a racial reckoning, I thought it important to bring forth this book that in very, just, I guess, unambiguous, bold, and declarative manner lays out first sociologically and with theological rooting, essentially what has happened in America. Dad speaks about the system, a trinity of capitalism, racism, and militarism, all working in concert to oppress people of color. Capitalism, that economic system that essentially determines who shall have and who shall not. And then racism, a social stratification of Blacks versus whites and other persons of color falling somewhere along the spectrum. A way of essentially saying, let's use race to justify who shall have and who shall not. And then militarism, using weapons, and military law enforcement forces as a way to continually suppress people into submission. And so this system works in concert to keep saying who shall have and who shall not. I thought it was important to bring the book back out to help people, not just Black persons, but all people understand what really is going on here. That it's racism, but it's coupled with and embedded in this larger system. It's not to say that we can't have capitalism, but it's to understand why racism exists in the first place so that we can then do something about it. Because, and I'll just say this and then I'll be quiet. If we just keep talking about racism as one person to another, right? How you treat me or how you think about me. Do you think that because I'm Black, I'm less than? Or I should, that you have privilege over me. And we treat it as a one-to-one relationship. Then we dismiss and we ignore the fact that in America, beginning with our Constitution that declared that Black persons were 3/5 human beings, that the laws of this nation are set up, they're structured to keep people of color at disadvantage. If we don't center on this system, and we keep trying to work on these issues one-on-one, we're never going to overcome it. And so I thought it important to put it back out there, to break it down for everybody so they understand the sociological underpinnings. Daddy studied sociology before he studied theology. And so the book, it just in very plain speak and declarative manner helps you understand what this is all about and what we're up against. I just thought it was necessary to put it back out here and let's have at it.
Well, as a white Baptist from the South, Jennifer, I've given my testimony a number of times in the writings in the Meetinghouse. I grew up, of course, very much immersed in this white culture in the South, very much indifferent to what you're talking about, the systemic racism all around me. And I remember very clearly in 2003, on the 100th anniversary of its publication, I read W.E.B. Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk. And then in 2008, I started the Academy of Preachers, which brought me into regular contact with the great Lawrence Carter of the King Chapel, and all of the young preachers like Richard, who started coming to the Academy of Preachers and preaching to me and for me. And it's hard for me to name anything in my 55-year ministerial career that has been more significant, more powerful, more transformative in my own life. I think I speak for a good number of white ministers in the South. And then, of course, in 2016, I hooked up with the great pastor of St. Stephen's Baptist Church, Kevin Cosby, who I need to send a shout out to because today's his birthday. Happy birthday, Kevin. Blessings on you. He started funneling books my way. The Half Has Never Been Told and From Here to Equality. And then the very next year, Jennifer, I met you in January of 2017 in Lexington, Kentucky. You came to the festival. You gave me the book. I read the book. We dedicated our book of sermons to your dad. I want to read the inscription. Dedicated to the inspirational, influential preacher of the gospel, William Augustus Jones, Jr., 1934-2006. And then I note the historic Pleasant Green Missionary Baptist Church, Lexington, Kentucky, Bethany Baptist Church, Brooklyn, New York. I just want to say, Jennifer, I am one of those who's been converted. And there are many of us who are with you and who believe in what you say and who recognize the systemic nature. But I'll tell you what, I was at the Southern Baptist Convention a month ago. I covered it as a journalist while they were debating critical race theory. You know, they stumble over the systemic part. It's exactly what you said.
Right.
It's exactly what you said.
You know, it's I've been thinking and talking a lot about critical race theory, and essentially what God in the Ghetto, the original, and what the reprint book it does is to help you actually understand a little better what is critical race theory and what this is all about. I think the challenge that we have in America as people, as human beings, just in our everyday walk, is it's hard to be wrong. It's hard to believe that you have hurt somebody, right? In our daily walk, black, white, or other, it's hard for us sometimes to come to terms with we hurt people, right? And that sometimes we are a part of systems that hurt people. We don't like to be told that we are bad. We don't want to be told that our parents were bad, that our parents' were bad. It's just human nature. It's the human makeup. It's our composition. We want to believe we're good. It's hard for us to believe that we are unknowingly part of a system that keeps certain people in an oppressive state. We want to believe that we're not a part of that. And I think the best way that we can help people to understand this is by actually being open and receptive to critical race theory. Because what critical race theory does is it helps you to appreciate you're part of a system that you didn't even create.
Right.
You are in many ways kind of, unconsciously, victim and victimizer in this in this system that you didn't birth. And so if we can but for a moment just kind of embrace that we are human and we are subject to, we are frail, but we're also subject to, to do things that maybe we don't intend, then that allows the doors of the mind to open up to embrace how something that was done in years past may still haunt you. And it may not be what I intend, but it is what is. That's what critical race theory does. Critical race theory says, back in, after the passage of the GI Bill, when discrimination was still abounding, and the government said people returning from World War II can have tuition-free education and 0% down home ownership, right? So
Right.
Blacks and whites come back from World War II. This is available to everybody. But the US government allowed for redlining of Black communities,
Better
which
explain what that is.
valued home ownership, right? So, and discrimination still persists. So a Black person can't go into a white community and buy a house, can keep buying homes in this Black community that have been redlined and devalued. Well, what happens is equity doesn't grow exponentially in that place. But a white person and family could go into the suburbs of New York City. Levittown is a great example. Get a home at 0% down and literally within a year have like significant sums of money in equity, and then turn around and use that equity, to purchase more or to send their children to school without having to take out loans because they could use the equity in the house. Then you begin to see the wealth divide, how that grows. Education, Black people couldn't go to every college and university because of discrimination. And the HBCUs were already filled with the Blacks who didn't serve in the war. So then the Blacks couldn't take advantage of the 0% down. That's critical race theory, helping you understand how the laws were created such that it allowed for white people to keep on moving up and Black people at best to stay where they were. Doesn't mean you were a part of that. Doesn't mean I was a part of that. Doesn't mean Reverend Hughes was a part of that. But we all had been subjected to it. And if we understand that and own it as something that happened, then maybe we can get beyond it. Can I just say one more thing?
Sure.
That a psychologist once said to me. My husband and I, we've been married for, soon to be 28 years. And in any marriage, and if anybody challenges me on this, I'll tell them, you have your ups and your downs, you have your good and your bad days, and sometimes you need a little help. So one time we found ourselves sitting on the couch of a therapist. And the therapist said to us at the beginning of the conversation, she said, I'm going to work with you all for 6 sessions. She said, and in those 6 sessions, if we haven't figured it out, then maybe you all need to see somebody to mediate a divorce. And she said, I'm going to give you tools with which to work. She said, but to work with you, I first got to make sure we're in the same place. She said, there are 3 types of people in the world. She said, there are those people who deny that there is a problem. She said, then there are those people who say, yeah, there's a problem, but so what? It is what it is, and I'm not going to do anything about it. And then she said, and then there are those people who say, there is a problem. I want to understand what the problem is so I can do things differently. Here in America, with our situation on the whole, is that we've got people who are falling in all 3 camps. And a lot of people who are in positions of power are in that first bucket, in that first camp. Deny. And what critical race theory is saying is we need to be more in that 3rd bucket, that 3rd camp. We've got a problem. Let's try to understand it so then we can then do something about it.
Jennifer, I'm broadcasting from North Carolina today, Henderson County, North Carolina, but my home is in Georgia. I'm from Kentucky, as you know, but I'm living now down in Glenn County, Georgia. And there's some peculiar things about this county. Number one, there's a portion of the county which is the wealthiest zip code in Georgia. It's called Sea Island, Georgia. You may know about it.
I've heard about it.
Our region includes Jekyll Island and St. Simon's Island and Brunswick, Georgia, where our radio broadcast is from. Brunswick is where Ahmaud Arbery was murdered on February the 23rd. So we've been following this story both locally and nationally now for, soon be a year and a half. But I remember the first time I drove through Brunswick on my way to the island. And I was just stunned at the deprivation that I saw and what a stark difference it was from the white communities on the island. It has made for a very, very uncomfortable situation for me, especially in the white congregation down there, where it's full of people who says There are no racists in our church. We treat everybody the same. We really don't have a problem. So I have dealt with exactly what you're describing, all three kinds of people in our county, not only leaders who represent all three kinds, but also, just ordinary citizens. And you were right a minute ago when you talked about this. They push back on the systemic part because they don't want to consider themselves. We don't want to consider ourselves, I should say, as bad people, as racist people, as complicit. And it's hard to confess this. It's hard to own up to it. So this past year, not only with the Ahmaud Arbery thing, but all over the country, what do you think about this, the impact of last year with the pandemic and the race, the global race stuff, and the national election? Where has this left the United States right now? What have we learned, or what are we facing?
So I'll first share with you that in the moments following in the days that followed the killing of George Floyd, as we're learning more about the circumstances concerning the killing of Ahmaud Arbery and the killing death of Breonna Taylor, we saw protests around the country and around the nation demanding justice when it comes to policing and ending racialized profiling and policing of Black and Brown communities. And I will tell you that I was heartened to see what was happening, because the people who were coming out were people of all races and ethnicities. But at the same time, I felt like a kind of like a punch in my stomach, a pain, because what I thought to myself was, it costs nothing to come out and speak against police misconduct and police brutality, excessive use of force. Whether you are white or Black, Asian, of Hispanic origin or other, it costs you nothing to finger point at the police and say, you are the bad guys and you need to stop what you're doing. And all I could think to myself was, if we were out here saying, okay, let's look at racism and bias in education, in housing, in jobs and wages, right? In healthcare, in environmental injustice, criminal injustice beyond policing, would we see such a diverse group of people in the streets protesting? And I fervently believe that the answer to that would be no, because we have made this it's so much tied to the capitalism piece. Who has and who doesn't? And when we begin talking about true equity, what that says to people is, well, if your kid goes to the school that I want my kid to go to, my kid can't go. Or if you're talking about paying fair wages for the lowest, skilled jobs, just so people can put food on the table and sleep in safe places, then that means maybe I'm not going to realize the profits that I do, and my salary can't be as high to do what I want to do for my family. What I think needs to happen in this moment is to really be having these direct, blunt conversations. And again, that's why I come back to God in the Ghetto, a prophetic word revisited, because that's what Dad was seeking to do in the book, to say what isn't being said. What is at the base and the core of all of this is this belief about a system where some can have and some cannot. Some will have and some will not. And so we've got to create a narrative, as false as it may be, as anti-Christian as it may be, about who is entitled to what and not. I'll share with you, in the book, Dad writes that the system reveals a sick sociology based on a faulty anthropology, which emanates from a false theology.
Yes, I underlined that in the book.
Right? And that spells it all out, because what he's saying there is that what we did in America was we declared as Christians that God is supreme, that God is the Almighty. There is one God. And then what we did was we said God is the image of God is that of a white male.
Right.
So what we said was, if God is supreme, anthropologically, if God is the image is that of a white male, then the white man, anthropologically speaking, is most like God.
Right.
And then sociologically, we're allowed to order our society such that the white man is on top and the black, the extreme opposite, black woman is on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why in our nation today, black women, right, the most educated segment of our population, but like lowest wage earners. Why? Black women, primary breadwinners in most of their homes. We have a situation where 1 in 4 black children live in poverty compared to less than 1 in 10 white children. Because our society said, based on this false narrative about what God is, who God is, what God requires of us, determined that it was okay for some to have and some not, and who would have and who would not. And so what we need to do is we need to just, in this moment, we may not solve this in the next 5 years, but if we don't start calling a spade and speaking the truth wherever it need be told, just as Jesus told us we are to do, we're not going to get anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So in this moment, that's what I believe. I believe we just need to speak this truth. I'll say one more thing. I could go on and on and on. But I'm going to give you a present day example of what this looks like. A really like just a concrete example. Just how the narrative just feeds and the lies just build. So our United States government has a federal poverty level. And that federal poverty level essentially says who is poor and who is not in America. The federal poverty level for one person in America is $12,800. What that means is that if you make more than $12,800, you are technically not poor. If you are a family of 4 and you make more than $25,800, you technically are not poor. Okay? Stay with me on this. That then allows this government to determine that we can maintain a federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, because $7.25 an hour annualized is $15,000. Mm-hmm. So for one person, if they're making $12,800, if they're making $15,000, that's more than the $12,800. For a family of 4, 2 children, 2 adults, if together they're working annualized at a minimum wage of $7.25, they're making $30,000, which is more than the $25,800. So technically, they're not poor. What that allows the government then to do is to actually undercount the number of people in America who are struggling to make ends meet. Fast forward, it then allows the government to say, we don't need to provide a significant amount of food support, healthcare support, housing support, public cash assistance, because not as many people really need it. The point I'm making is we are living into these systemic lies that if we don't call them out, we don't awaken people to the realities. And this is our moment. Black, white, and other, we're all suffering and struggling. It's not Black people alone who are poor. We're all struggling and suffering to call out these lies and say, wait a minute, you got to do these things differently.
That's why, if I can interject on that, that's why I think it was great that recently it went viral. I can't remember what city it was in, but some Burger King employees had posted a sign saying that they quit. And in the last few months, there's been a lot of controversy around getting people back to work. And part of the issue that people don't realize is that you're asking a lot of people to go back to a job that, as we've seen during the pandemic, is paying a minimum wage, and they were making more collecting unemployment benefits than they were actually working 9 to 5, 8 to 4, whatever. And what people aren't calling out is, while they're criticizing individuals for not going back to work and for quote unquote sucking up unemployment, they're not calling out these companies for underpaying their workers while they're paying CEOs millions, if not billions of dollars to sit there and collect the money that these underpaid workers are gathering.
Right.
And they're not calling out the conditions of these places that if these people go back to work, they're probably going to be exposed to coronavirus again, because they're not doing their due diligence to keep the place sanitized and clean like they should be doing. And like I said, it just goes back to that capitalistic society that we live in, that there are people that are just making millions of dollars off of the unpaid labor of these individuals. So it's like we would rather criticize the individual than call out the system.
Right. And Reverend Hughes, I'm so glad you raised that, because what did the United States government do? There were people in the United States government, in the Senate, that said we shouldn't extend the unemployment benefit because people then won't go back to work, rather than centering on, well, why?
Yeah.
And the why would be because we have a federal minimum wage that allows the corporations to pay less than fair livable wages. So fix the wage and government doesn't have to dole out the money.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And so I say all of that to say is the system is not serving us well, white, black, and other. But we're afraid to look at it for a host of reasons. In New York City, I lead the New York City Racial Justice Commission, and we're centering on the structural laws of our Constitution that have birthed and upheld systemic racism, that have allowed for power to reside with some people and not others, for true access and opportunity to sit in the hands of some and not others. And what I'm learning is that for so long, we've been engaged in the work of kind of alleviating the burdens of the effects of poverty. And that's what our systems are doing. They're not really trying to dismantle them. And true liberation work, as God intended, as Jesus intended, requires, Jesus went to the temples. It was like, you're not doing what God has said you should do. Amos, right? The great prophet Amos called out the people. Said, you're not doing what God intends. That's what we need to be doing in this moment. Right. Challenging ourselves, even when it hurts. I'm a Black woman. I lead a nonprofit organization. I'm in the process right now of hiring a director for outreach and engagement. I have in my organization a Black woman who's been working as our coordinator of faith. She's been there now for 5 years. And I realized that we hired a director 6 years, twice during this time. And we went outside and looked for somebody. But when I needed to hire a director in another area of the organization, and then a chief program officer, I hired from within. When I went to hire a COO, I hired from within. And you know what I realized? This is me humbling myself, and I haven't shared this with anybody. They were white people I was promoting from within. But why did I think that I needed to go out and find somebody to be this Black woman's boss? And I had to check myself. Why was I willing to believe in white people and their ability to be promoted from within, but I was questioning this Black woman who is doing the work?
Right.
We all have bias.
Oh, yeah.
We all are part of this system. And we all have to humble ourselves in this moment and check ourselves.
I'm going to tell you a personal story of bias. a crew of tree cutters came to our property to cut down a tree. There was a young white man, there was a middle-aged black man, there was an older white man. And they were working, and I knew they were going to pick up all of their debris when they finished. And I had already piled up my own yard debris. So I went over to the crew chief and asked him if they would pick up my pile of debris when they were cleaning up the yard. This is what he said to me. He said, well, we probably can, but you need to talk to the boss over there. And he pointed to the black man.
Yes.
I had assumed
Yes.
that the black man was working for the white man.
Yes.
That is a small but subtle kind of racism that many of us have to deal with.
Right. White and black.
White and black. You know, when the book first came out in 1979, there was only one name associated with it, and that was your dad, the preacher. But now you have brought to this book a veritable who's who of black leaders in the United States. It's quite impressive. Michael Eric Dyson, James Forbes, Frederick Haynes, Marvin McMickle, Al Sharpton.
William Barber.
Yes, William Barber. You've got all these people involved in this, but I want to tell you something. White people all over the country are reading books about racism. In churches, there are reading groups all over looking for books to read about helping all of us understand our own prejudices and what the facts are in the world. And I want to commend you for doing this, because this is the kind of book that these church reading clubs need to pick up. Oh, yeah. They need to be reading it.
Thank you.
It's got a great mixture of sermons, both the original sermons and then the 5 extra ones you put in, I think. And then all of these essays that these stellar authors and scholars have written. I commend you for it, Jennifer.
Thank you. There's a sermon that I put in the book that is one of my favorites. So the book original print has 6 sermons, and I've added 5 more. And one of them, and they're all like social justice, social gospel oriented sermons. One of them is titled "The Majority That Matters," and essentially what Dad writes and preaches about is that we have to understand that sometimes we are going to be engaged in doing the work that we believe God requires of us. And it may not be popular. It may not be the work that everybody else believes should be done. But if you believe that you're moving with God and you're engaging in the way that He desires, the way that God desires, then it's okay. Because while you may be in the minority, you're in the majority that matters.
That's right. Jennifer, thank you for being my guest in the Meeting House today. Our hour is gone. Richard, thank you for being here and co-hosting this show with me today. I look forward for more opportunities and we can work together. Blessings on you. I'm going to help promote your book.
Thank you.
And God's blessing on your work. You're in a strategic place there in New York City. I want to thank all of our listeners today. I want to thank my 2 engineers, Everett down in Brunswick, Georgia, and Alex in Lexington, Kentucky. Thank all of our listeners and viewers and readers for your support of the Meeting House. Hope you have a great day. I'll be back next week, and my guest is Tom Krottenmacher, who is the religion writer for the USA Today newspaper. Another longtime friend of mine. You'll enjoy talking with him. Thanks to everybody. This is Dwight Moody in the Meeting House. Have a great day.
You have been in the Meeting House with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation on religion and American life.